I thought the man I married was my forever, until the day I found out he'd already promised forever to someone else. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the days when love felt like sunshine and promises felt like solid ground beneath my feet. I was 23 years old when I met Michael, a fresh-faced teacher at Jefferson Elementary School in a quiet California suburb where everyone knew everyone's name. It was 1968, and the world felt full of possibility. I had just started my second year of teaching third grade, pouring my heart into shaping young minds and believing in happy endings like the ones in the fairy tales I read to my students. Michael walked into my life on a crisp September morning at the local diner where I had breakfast every Sunday after church. He was sitting at the counter, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, his hair neatly combed back in that way men wore it then. When he smiled at me, it was like the sun had found a way to shine brighter. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, the only person who mattered. We started talking, and hours passed like minutes. He told me he worked in sales for an automotive company, traveling throughout California to meet with dealerships. He had ambition in his eyes and dreams in his voice. He spoke about building a life, having a home with a white picket fence, raising children who would grow up knowing they were loved. Everything I'd ever wanted seemed to align perfectly with everything he'd described. Our courtship was like something out of a movie. He'd pick me up after school in his Chevy Impala, and we'd drive to the coast to watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. We'd sit in diners until midnight, sharing milkshakes and talking about everything and nothing. He'd leave little notes in my mailbox, simple things like thinking of you or you made my day brighter. I fell in love with him the way you fall asleep, slowly, and then, all at once. 6 months later, under a canopy of stars at the same beach where we'd watched our first sunset together, Michael got down on one knee. The ring was modest, a small diamond that caught the moonlight, but to me it represented everything. When he asked me to be his wife, to build a life with him, to grow old together, I said yes without a moment's hesitation. I believed in him. I believed in us. We married in the spring of 1969, in a small ceremony at the Presbyterian Church. My mother cried happy tears. My father shook Michael's hand and told him to take good care of his little girl, and I walked down the aisle in my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. Our wedding night was spent in a modest hotel room in San Francisco, and our honeymoon was a 3-day road trip up the coast. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. The first years of our marriage were filled with simple joys. We rented a small 2-bedroom house with a yard where I planted roses and tomatoes. I'd come home from school, and he'd come home from his sales routes, and we'd cook dinner together in our tiny kitchen, dancing to records on our second-hand player. On weekends, we'd host barbecues for friends, play board games, and talk about the future we were building. But there was one shadow that began to creep over our happiness, one wound that neither of us could quite heal. I couldn't get pregnant. Month after month, I'd hope and pray, and month after month, my hopes would be dashed. We saw doctors, tried everything they suggested in those days, but nothing worked. The diagnosis was vague, something about my anatomy that made conception nearly impossible. I felt broken, like I was failing at the most fundamental thing a woman was supposed to do. Michael would hold me when I cried, telling me it didn't matter, that we had each other, that maybe we could adopt someday. But I could see something changing. In his eyes, a distance growing that I couldn't quite bridge. He started taking more business trips, staying away longer, coming home later when he was in town. When I'd ask about his day, his answers became shorter, more evasive. I told myself it was just stress from work. His company was expanding. He had more territory to cover, more clients to manage. I made excuses for the late-night phone calls he'd take in the garage, the way he'd suddenly need to leave town at odd hours, the receipts I'd find in his pockets for restaurants in cities he'd never mentioned visiting. There were other little things too, things I noticed but pushed to the back of my mind because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that something was terribly wrong. A faint scent of perfume on his collar that wasn't mine, a floral fragrance I couldn't place, gifts on our credit card statement that I never received, flowers and jewelry that never made it home. A second wallet I found once in his briefcase, tucked into a hidden pocket, with photos I'd never seen. When I'd bring up these concerns, Michael would get defensive. "You're imagining things," he'd say, his voice taking on an edge. "You're being paranoid. I'm working my tail off for us, for our future, and this is the thanks I get. And like so many women before me and after me, I'd apologize, I'd blame my suspicions on my own insecurities, on the pain of not being able to give him children, on my loneliness when he was away. I threw myself into my teaching, staying late to help struggling students, volunteering for every school committee, anything to fill the empty hours. I'd come home to our quiet house and cook elaborate dinners that often went cold because he'd called to say he wouldn't make it home that night. I'd sit alone at our kitchen table, looking at his empty chair, and wonder what I was doing wrong. My mother noticed the change in me. "You look tired, sweetheart," she'd say during our weekly phone calls. "Is everything all right with you and Michael?" I'd lie, painting a picture of a happy marriage because admitting the truth felt like admitting failure. I'd smile at church potlucks when people asked about us, nod politely when they'd say what a lucky woman I was to have such a hard-working husband. But at night, when I was alone in our bed, listening to the silence, I'd pray. I'd pray for answers, for peace, for understanding. I'd pray that I was wrong about everything, that my fears were just shadows with no substance. I thought if I could just love him harder, be a better wife, keep a cleaner house, cook better meals, be more understanding about his absences, he'd love me back the same way I loved him. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it's buried. Mine came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 5 years into our marriage. The air had that crisp autumn bite to it, and I remember thinking how beautiful the leaves looked, gold and crimson against the blue sky, having no idea that beauty would be the last thing I'd noticed that day. Michael had left 3 days earlier for what he said was an important conference in Sacramento. He'd be gone until Friday, he told me, kissing my forehead in that distracted way that had become normal. I'd waved goodbye from our front porch, watching his car disappear down the street, feeling that familiar ache of loneliness settle over me. I was in my classroom after school, grading spelling tests, when the office secretary knocked on my door. "Phone call for you," she said. They said it was urgent. My heart jumped, thinking something had happened to my parents or to Michael. I rushed to the office, my hands shaking as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice tight with worry. There was a pause, and then a woman's voice, soft but firm, said, "Is this Mrs. Thompson, Michael Thompson's wife?" "Yes," I replied, confused. "Who is this?" Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her breathing, could feel her hesitation through the phone line. "You should know," she finally said. "He's not who you think he is." "I'm sorry, I thought you deserved to know." And then she gave me an address, a street name in a town called Riverside, about 45 minutes from where we live. Before I could ask any questions, before I could demand to know who she was or what this was about, the line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, my mind racing. Every instinct told me not to go, to ignore this anonymous call, to trust my husband. But something deeper, something that had been whispering warnings to me for years, told me I needed to see for myself. I told the principal I had a family emergency and left school early, something I'd never done before. The drive to Riverside felt both endless and too short. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I kept telling myself there would be a logical explanation, that I'd get to this address and find nothing, that I'd feel foolish for doubting Michael. But in my heart, I knew, I think I'd known for a long time. But knowing and accepting are two very different things. The address led me to a modest neighborhood, working-class homes with small yards and chain-link fences. I found the house number, a pale yellow house with white shutters and a tricycle on the front lawn. My stomach lurched. I parked across the street, several houses down, trying to steady my breathing. And then I saw him. Michael walked out the front door, laughing, in his arms a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. She had dark curly hair and was wearing a pink dress with white flowers. She was giggling, throwing her head back with pure joy, and Michael was spinning her around, kissing her cheek, calling her his little princess. I could hear him even from where I sat, could hear the love in his voice, a tenderness I hadn't heard directed at me in years. A woman stepped out onto the porch, younger than me, pretty in a simple way, visibly pregnant. She was smiling at them, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Michael set the little girl down and walked over to this woman, this stranger who wasn't a stranger to him, and kissed her. Not a peck, not a polite gesture, but a real kiss, the kind of kiss that spoke of intimacy and familiarity and love. The little girl ran to them, and they all stood together on that porch. this perfect little family, while I sat in my car across the street feeling my entire world crumble into dust. This wasn't an affair. This was a life, a whole separate life he'd built while I waited for him in our empty house, making excuses for his absences, blaming myself for not being enough. I watched them for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I watched Michael carry the little girl inside, watched the woman follow them, her hand on his back, watched the door close on this family I never knew existed, and I sat there in my car and cried, silent tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with a grief so profound it felt like I was dying. I don't remember driving home. I moved through the motions mechanically, parking in our driveway, walking into our house that suddenly felt like a stage set, props in a play I'd been performing without knowing it wasn't real. Everything looked the same, our furniture, our dishes, our wedding photos on the wall. But everything felt different, like I was seeing it all through new eyes. I didn't confront him immediately. I couldn't. I needed to think, needed to process, needed to understand the magnitude of what I'd discovered. For 2 days, I moved through my life like a ghost, teaching my students, smiling when required, speaking when spoken to. But inside I was screaming. I looked at our bed and wondered how many lies had been told there. I looked at our kitchen table and wondered how many meals we'd shared while he was thinking about them. When Michael came home on Friday, exactly when he said he would, whistling as he walked through the door with his briefcase and his travel bag, I was packed. Not everything, just enough. 2 suitcases by the door, my most important belongings. The things that were mine before they were ours. He saw the suitcases and his face went pale. "What's going on?" he asked, but his voice was wrong, too careful, like he already knew. I handed him a note I'd written. My hand was steady, even though my heart was breaking. The note said simply, "You didn't lose me because of what you did. You lost me because you thought I'd never find out. Don't try to find me. Don't try to explain. There's nothing you could say that would matter now." "Wait," he said, reaching for me, but I stepped back. I wouldn't let him touch me, wouldn't let him taint me further with his lies. "How long?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "How long have you had another family?" His face crumbled, and in that moment, I saw the truth of everything. "It's not what you think," he started, but I held up my hand. "Don't," I said. "Don't insult me with more lies. I saw them, Michael. I saw your daughter. I saw your pregnant wife." "How long?" He couldn't even look at me. 6 years, he whispered. "We met right before you and I got married. I couldn't choose. I thought I could make it work. Keep both lives separate. 6 years. Our entire marriage had been a lie. Before we even said our vows, he'd been with her. Every promise he made to me, he'd already made to someone else. Every I love you was divided, halved, meaningless." "Did she know about me?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of the betrayal. "Not at first," he admitted. "She found out a couple years ago. She was going to leave, but then she got pregnant again, and I promised her I'd fix things, that I'd choose. And you chose her," I said. "And it wasn't a question." "No," he said desperately. "I couldn't choose. I love you both. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true." I kept thinking I could figure it out, that somehow I could keep everyone happy. I laughed then, a bitter sound I didn't recognize as my own. "Keep everyone happy. Michael, I've been dying inside for years. I thought I was the problem. I thought I wasn't enough because I couldn't give you children. And all this time, you had a child. You have a daughter who calls you daddy, and I've been breaking my heart month after month thinking I'd failed you." "That wasn't about you," he said, and I could see he actually believed that. Could see he'd somehow separated these 2 lives so completely in his mind that he thought one didn't affect the other. "Everything was about this," I said, gesturing between us. "Every lie, every absence, every moment you made me feel crazy for questioning you. You did that. You chose to do that to me every single day." I picked up my suitcases. My best friend Margaret was waiting outside in her car. I'd called her the day before, told her everything, and she'd immediately offered me a place to stay. "I'm filing for divorce," I told him. "Don't contest it. You owe me that much." "Please," he said, and there were tears in his eyes now. "Please, can we just talk about this? I can explain everything. I can make this right." "There is no right anymore," I said. "There's just different versions of wrong, and I refuse to be part of any of them." I walked out of that house, out of that marriage, out of that life, and I didn't look back. Margaret was there, steady and strong. And she drove me to her guest room where I finally allowed myself to completely fall apart. I cried for days, deep wrenching sobs that left me exhausted and empty. I cried for the years I'd lost, for the trust that had been shattered, for the future I'd imagined that would never exist. But eventually, the tears dried up. Eventually, I had to face the practical realities of my situation. I filed for divorce, and true to my word, I made it as simple as possible. I didn't want his money, didn't want anything that tied me to him. I just wanted it over. He didn't contest it, probably out of guilt, possibly out of relief. 6 months later, it was final, and I was no longer Mrs. Michael Thompson. I went back to my maiden name, Sarah Mitchell, and it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost. I couldn't stay in that town though. Everywhere I looked, I saw our life together, saw the ghost of who I'd been when I believed in him. I needed a fresh start, a place where nobody knew my story, where I could rebuild myself from the ground up. I found a small town in Northern California called Cedar Creek, a place where the air smelled like pine trees and the pace of life moved slower. I got a job at the local library, a quiet position that suited my need for peace. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough for the small cottage I rented on the edge of town, a place with a porch that overlooked a creek and a garden where I could plant new roses. Those first years were hard. People think heartbreak heals with time, and maybe it does, but the healing isn't linear. There were days when I'd wake up and forget, just for a moment, that my life had changed. I'd roll over expecting to see Michael there, and the reality of his absence would hit me all over again. There were holidays that felt impossibly lonely, birthdays I spent alone, anniversaries of a marriage that no longer existed that would creep up on me and steal my breath. I'd wonder about them sometimes, about his other family. I'd wonder if his daughter knew about me, if his second child had been born, if he ever thought about what he'd destroyed. Every Christmas, I'd imagine him there with them, playing with his children, being the father he'd never gotten to be with me. Every birthday, I'd remember how he used to make such a fuss about mine, breakfast in bed and small, thoughtful gifts, and I'd wonder if he did the same for her. But slowly, day by day, step by step, I began to build a new life. I discovered that healing isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet mornings with coffee and no lies. It's going to bed without wondering where someone really is. It's learning to trust your own perceptions again, to believe what your eyes see and your heart knows without someone telling you you're wrong. The library became my sanctuary. I loved the smell of old books, the quiet rustle of pages, the people who would come in seeking stories, or information, or just a friendly face. I got to know the regulars, the elderly man who read every Western we had, the young mother who brought her toddler to story time every Tuesday, the high school students who studied at the corner table. I started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, helping women who were leaving difficult situations, many of them escaping marriages far worse than mine had been. I'd listen to their stories, help them navigate the practical aspects of starting over, and in helping them, I helped myself heal. I learned that my experience, as painful as it was, had given me something valuable, the knowledge that you can survive that you can rebuild after everything falls apart. I made friends, real friends, women who knew my story and didn't judge, who saw me for who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. There was Helen, a retired schoolteacher who lived next door and would bring me soup when I was sick. There was Ruth, who ran the local bookstore and shared my love of mystery novels. There was Grace, a widow who understood loss and would sit with me on hard days without needing to fill the silence with platitudes. The years passed, and I grew into myself in ways I never had before. I took up painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I loved the way the colors mixed on the canvas, the way I could create something beautiful out of nothing. I started hiking the trails around Cedar Creek, pushing my body up steep inclines and feeling proud when I reached the summit and could see for miles. I dated occasionally, though nothing serious ever developed. I'd learned to be cautious with my heart, to recognize red flags I'd once ignored. There was a kind veterinarian named Thomas who took me to dinner a few times, but when he got a job offer in Seattle, we parted as friends. There was a widower named Frank who I met at church, but we both realized we were better suited as companions than lovers. I was okay with that. I wasn't looking to fill a void anymore. I was complete on my own. Financially, I was stable. I lived simply, saved carefully, and found I needed less than I once thought. My little cottage was paid for after 10 years, a source of pride that I owned something that was truly mine. I had a garden that grew vegetables in summer and a fireplace that kept me warm in winter. I had books to read and trails to walk and friends to share coffee with. It was a small life by some standards, but it was peaceful, and after years of chaos disguised as marriage, peace was precious. I became known around Cedar Creek as someone people could talk to, someone who would listen without judgment and offer advice if asked. Younger women would sometimes seek me out, troubled by relationships or life decisions, and I'd share what I'd learned, that you teach people how to treat you, that intuition is worth listening to, that being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel alone. My mother passed away when I was 42. My father 2 years later. Sorting through their belongings, I found letters my mother had saved, letters I'd written them throughout my marriage. Reading them, I could see the denial I'd been living in, the way I'd painted over problems with optimistic words. I could see my mother's gentle concerns reading between the lines of her responses. I wished I could tell her that I'd finally understood what she'd been trying to say, that I'd finally chosen myself. The decades moved forward as they do. I turned 50, then 55, then 60. My hair turned silver, lines appeared on my face, my hands developed a slight tremor and spots of age, but I felt more myself than I ever had. I'd grown comfortable in my own skin, confident in my own worth, content with my own company. I'd occasionally hear news about Michael through the strange grapevine that exists even when you try to leave someone behind. A former mutual friend mentioned once that he'd lost his job, that his wife had left him. Someone else said they'd heard he'd tried to contact me through my old friend Margaret, but she'd refused to give him any information. I felt a twinge of something, not satisfaction exactly, but a recognition that the universe has its own way of balancing scales. I never remarried. People would ask me sometimes why not, especially in those earlier years when I was still young enough by society's standards. I'd tell them I was content as I was, which was true, but the deeper truth was that I'd learned to value my peace more than the idea of partnership. I'd learned that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing, that you can build a full life without a romantic relationship at its center. I retired from the library at 6, though I continued to volunteer there twice a week. I spent more time painting, took a pottery class at the community center, traveled a bit to places I'd always wanted to see. I went to the Grand Canyon and stood at its edge, marveling at the way time and water can carve such beauty out of solid rock. I went to Yellowstone and watched Old Faithful erupt right on schedule, reliable in a way people rarely are. I went to the coast and walked beaches I'd once walked with Michael, reclaiming them as mine alone. My friend Margaret, who had stood by me through everything, died suddenly of a heart attack when we were both sick. Her loss devastated me in a different way than Michael's betrayal had. Her loss was clean, final, without the taint of dishonesty. At her funeral, I spoke about true friendship, about the kind of love that shows up in a car outside your house when your world is falling apart, the kind that never asks for anything in return. Life became quieter still. I was 73, content in my routine, surrounded by my books and my garden and my memories, both bitter and sweet. I'd made peace with my past, or so I thought. I'd accepted that some questions would never be answered, some wounds would always leave scars, and that was okay. I thought my story with Michael was finished. That chapter closed and filed away. I was wrong. It was a rainy evening in late October, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones and the wind makes the windows rattle. I was in my favorite chair by the fireplace, a mystery novel in my lap and a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the side table, when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends knew to call first, and I rarely had unexpected visitors in Cedar Creek. For a moment, I considered not answering, but something made me set down my book and shuffle to the door. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was fate. I opened the door, and there he was, Michael, but not the Michael I'd last seen 40-some years ago. This Michael was old, bent, diminished. His hair was white and thinning, his face deeply lined, his eyes sunken and red. He was wearing a worn coat that had seen better days, and he was soaking wet from the rain. For a long moment, we just stood there, looking at each other across the decades. "Sarah," he said, and his voice cracked. "I know I have no right to be here, but I need to talk to you, please." Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face. Part of me wanted to tell him exactly what his presence on my doorstep meant, the audacity it took to show up after all these years, but there was something in his eyes, a brokenness so profound that I recognized it because I'd once felt it myself. "Come in," I heard myself say. You're soaking wet. He stepped inside, dripping on my doormat, looking around my little cottage with an expression I couldn't quite read. I got him a towel, gesturing for him to sit at my kitchen table while I made tea. We moved around each other like strangers, which I suppose we were. The man I'd known, or thought I'd known, no longer existed, if he ever had. I set a mug of tea in front of him and sat across the table, waiting. I wouldn't make this easy. If he'd come all this way, tracked me down after all these years, he'd have to be the one to explain why. How did you find me? I asked finally. It wasn't easy, he said. Took me 2 years. You covered your tracks well. I wanted to be found by people who mattered, I said. You're not one of them. He flinched but nodded. I deserve that. I deserve worse than that. Why are you here, Michael? He wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to absorb its warmth. I wanted you to know the truth, the whole truth. Not that it matters anymore, not that it changes anything, but I thought you deserved to know. I know the truth, I said. You had 2 families. You lied to everyone. What else is there? Everything, he said quietly. It all fell apart, Sarah. Everything. Just like you probably hoped it would. I never hoped for that, I said, and it was true. I just hoped for peace. He told me then, the whole story, or at least his version of it, how his wife, Jennifer was her name, had left him 15 years ago, taking their 2 children, now grown, with her, how she'd found out about more lies, more women, over the years, how his daughter, the one I'd seen that day, hadn't spoken to him in a decade, how his son wanted nothing to do with him. He told me how he'd lost his job, burned through his money, ended up alone, in a small apartment with nothing but regrets, how he'd tried to reach out to his children, begging for forgiveness, but they'd built lives without him and saw no reason to let him back in, how Jennifer had remarried, found someone who truly loved her, and built the stable life she'd deserved all along. I destroyed everything I touched, he said, tears running down his weathered face. Everyone who ever loved me, I ruined, and the worst part is, I did it to myself. Nobody did this to me. I did it. I listened without interrupting, watching this broken old man cry at my kitchen table. I waited to feel satisfaction, for some sense of vindication or justice served. But all I felt was a strange kind of sadness, not for him specifically, but for all the wasted years, for all the damage done. Why come here? I asked when he'd finished. Why now, after all this time? He looked up at me, and his eyes were ancient with regret. Because you were the only one who ever truly loved me. Not the image of me, not what I could give you, but actually me. You loved me when I didn't deserve it, and I threw it away. I threw away the only real thing I ever had. You're wrong, I said quietly. I loved who I thought you were. I never knew the real you. The real you was a liar and a coward, who couldn't commit to anything except his own selfishness. You're right, he said. God, you're right. But I needed you to know that I know that now. I needed you to know that you weren't the problem. You were never the problem. It was always me. We sat in silence for a while, the rain beating against the windows, the fire crackling in the other room. I looked at this old man who had once been my husband, who had once been the center of my world, and I felt nothing. No love, no hate, no anger, no bitterness. He was just a person who had once hurt me very badly, and now that person was hurting too, but it wasn't my job to fix him anymore. I forgave you a long time ago, I finally said, not because you deserved it, but because carrying anger was making me sick. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean friendship. It doesn't mean I owe you anything. I know, he said. I know. I just needed to see you one more time, to tell you I'm sorry, even though sorry doesn't cover it, to tell you that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life, even though I didn't realize it until it was far too late. I stood up, signaling that this conversation was ending. There's a motel about 2 miles down the main road, I said. They're cheap and clean. You can stay there tonight, get dry, rest. Tomorrow, you need to leave and not come back. Sarah, he said, standing too, reaching out like he might touch my arm, but thinking better of it. Can I ask you one thing? You can ask. Did you ever find happiness? After me, after everything? Did you build a good life? I looked at him steadily. I built a peaceful life. I built an honest life. I built a life where I wake up every morning and know exactly who I am and where I stand. I have friends who love me, a home that's mine, and integrity intact. So yes, Michael, I found something better than happiness. I found contentment. His face crumpled at that, and I could see the magnitude of what he'd lost, finally hitting him. Not just me, but the possibility of the kind of peace I'd found, the peace that only comes from living honestly. You taught me what love isn't, I said as I walked him to the door, and for that, strange as it sounds, I thank you, because knowing what love isn't helped me understand what it should be. It helped me love myself enough to walk away. That's a valuable lesson, even if it was a painful one. I opened the door, the rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the night air smelled clean and fresh. Michael stood on my threshold, looking back at me one last time. I hope you find peace too, I said, and I meant it. I hope you figure out how to live with yourself, but you need to do that somewhere else, without me. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked out into the rain. I watched him disappear down my driveway, a lonely figure in the night, and I felt the symbolic weight of it, the same rain as the night I'd left him all those years ago. The same sense of ending, but this time I was the one standing strong while he walked away broken. I closed the door and returned to my chair by the fire. My tea had gone cold, but my book was still there, waiting. I picked it up and tried to read, but my mind was elsewhere, processing the visit, the conversation, the strange closure it had brought. The next morning, I woke early, as always. I made my coffee, sat on my porch wrapped in a blanket despite the chill, and watched the sun rise over the creek. The rain had cleared the air, leaving everything crisp and bright. Droplets of water clung to the roses I'd planted years ago, catching the light like tiny diamonds. I thought about Michael, wondered if he'd actually gone to the motel or kept driving, wondered if I'd ever see him again. I hoped not. There was nothing more to say, no further healing to be done in his presence. He was part of my past, a significant part certainly, but still just the past. What struck me most about his visit was how little I'd felt. When I'd first left him, when the wound was still fresh, I'd imagined confronting him someday. I'd rehearsed angry speeches, cutting remarks, ways to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But when the moment actually came, none of that mattered. The anger had burned itself out years ago, leaving only a kind of indifference. That's when I realized I'd truly healed. Healing isn't about reaching a place where you can face your hurt without anger. It's about reaching a place where the person who hurt you no longer has any power over your emotions at all. They become just another person, just another part of your history, no more significant than any other chapter you've moved beyond. Life continued its gentle rhythm. My neighbor Helen stopped by later that morning with fresh-baked scones, and we sat on my porch drinking coffee and talking about her grandchildren's latest antics. She didn't know about Michael's visit, and I didn't tell her. Some things are meant to be processed privately. That afternoon, I volunteered at the library, as usual. A young woman came in, maybe 30 years old, with that particular look of someone carrying a heavy burden. She asked me for book recommendations, and we got to talking. She told me she was going through a divorce, that her husband had been unfaithful, that she felt broken and didn't know how to put herself back together. I made her tea in the library's small break room, and we talked for over an hour. I told her my story, the abbreviated version, and I told her the truth I'd learned, that healing takes time, that it's okay to not be okay for a while, that the person you become after surviving something like this is often stronger and wiser than the person you were before. Does it ever stop hurting? She asked me, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I told her honestly, not all at once, and not in a straight line. Some days you'll feel fine, and then something small will knock you back. But gradually, the good days outnumbered the bad ones. Eventually, you'll realize you've gone a whole week without thinking about him, then a month, then you'll think about him and realize it doesn't hurt anymore. She thanked me, hugging me tight before she left, and I saw in her eyes the same lost look I'd once had. I hoped she'd find her way through, hoped she'd be one of the ones who came out stronger. The weeks passed, turning into months. Winter settled over Cedar Creek, blanketing everything in snow. I spent my days reading by the fire, baking bread that made my cottage smell like comfort, and working on a quilt I'd started years ago. I had dinner with friends, attended church on Sundays, lived my quiet, content life. I never heard from Michael again. Part of me wondered what happened to him, if he'd found any peace. But it was a distant curiosity, like wondering about a character in a book after you've finished reading their story. What I came to understand in those months after his visit was that his appearance hadn't really been about closure. I'd already had closure, had made my peace with the past, long before he showed up at my door. His visit had been about him seeking something he'd lost, trying to find absolution or understanding or maybe just someone who remembered who he'd been before he destroyed everything. But I couldn't give him that. I could only give him the truth that he'd hurt me deeply, that I'd survived, and that his absence from my life had ultimately been a gift. That's the strange paradox of painful experiences. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best changes you make. Spring came early that year. The snow melted, revealing the green underneath, and my garden began to show signs of life. I planted new roses, pink ones this time, and some lavender that would attract butterflies in the summer. I repainted my front porch, a cheerful yellow that made me smile every time I came home. My friend Ruth from the bookstore introduced me to her daughter, who had just moved to Cedar Creek with her husband and their 5-year-old daughter, Emma. The little girl was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs, but she loved books, and that gave us common ground. Soon, she was asking her mother if they could visit Miss Sarah at the library, and I became something like an honorary grandmother to her daughter. Emma would come to storytime on Tuesdays, always sitting in the front row, her eyes wide as I read about adventures and magic and brave children who overcame obstacles. Afterward, she'd help me shelve books, carefully placing each one in its proper spot, so serious and determined that it made my heart squeeze with affection. One afternoon, Emma's mother dropped her off for a special visit. We'd planned to bake cookies together, something I'd mentioned wanting to do. We made chocolate chip cookies, and Emma stood on a stool at my counter, carefully measuring ingredients and stirring the batter with intense concentration. "Miss Sarah," she said as we waited for the cookies to bake, "my mommy says you're very wise." I laughed at that. "I don't know about wise, sweetheart. I've just lived a long time and learned a few things along the way." "What did you learn?" she asked with that pure curiosity only children have. I thought about it, about how to distill decades of experience into something a 5-year-old could understand. I learned that being kind is more important than being right. I learned that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you try to do better next time. And I learned that the people who really love you will show it by their actions, not just their words. She nodded solemnly, like this made perfect sense. "I love you, Miss Sarah," she said simply, "and I show it by making cookies with you." My eyes stung with sudden tears. This child, who I'd known for only a few months, had just shown me a kind of pure, uncomplicated love I'd forgotten existed. "I love you too, Emma," I said, hugging her close. And yes, making cookies together is a wonderful way to show it. As the years continued to unfold, Emma became a regular presence in my life. Her parents would drop her off on Saturday mornings, and we'd work in the garden together, or I'd teach her to paint, or we'd simply read books on my porch. She filled a space in my heart I hadn't realized was empty, the space that had ached when I thought about the children I'd never had. I realized that life has a way of giving you what you need, even if it's not in the form you expected. I'd grieved deeply for the children I couldn't have with Michael, had felt like a failure as a woman because I couldn't conceive. But here was this beautiful child who called me Grandma Sarah even though we shared no blood, who loved me simply because I was present in her life, and showed her love in return. Her parents appreciated the bond we'd formed. Her mother told me once that I was teaching Emma things they couldn't, giving her the kind of wisdom that only comes from long experience. Her father built me a new bookshelf for my birthday, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, and told me I'd become family to them. I was 78 when Emma turned 10. She was growing into a thoughtful, curious young girl, always asking questions about life and love and how the world worked. One summer evening, we were sitting on my porch, watching the fireflies dance over the creek, drinking lemonade and enjoying the warm breeze. "Grandma Sarah," she said, using the name she'd adopted naturally, "my friend Lily's parents are getting divorced. She's really sad about it." "That must be hard for her," I said gently. "Were you ever married?" Emma asked. She'd never asked before, and I'd never volunteered the information. I said, "a long time ago." What happened? I considered how to answer, how much truth to share with attention. But Emma deserved honesty, age-appropriate honesty, just like anyone else. "He wasn't the person I thought he was," I said. "He made choices that hurt me very badly, and I had to leave to protect myself." "Were you sad?" "Very sad," I admitted, "for a long time. But you're happy now," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm content now," I said, "which is even better than happy. Happy comes and goes, but contentment is deeper. It's knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be." She thought about this, her young face serious in the fading light. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "If you'd stayed with him, you wouldn't be here with me." The simple wisdom of children. She was right, of course. If I'd stayed in that marriage, if I'd accepted Michael's betrayal and tried to make it work, I would have missed this entire life. I would have missed Cedar Creek and my friends and my peaceful cottage and this wonderful child who had become so important to me. You're absolutely right, I told her, pulling her close, and I wouldn't trade this life for anything. That night, after Emma's parents picked her up, I sat alone on my porch and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the years of rebuilding, all of it had led to this moment of peace. Michael's visit a few years earlier had been a punctuation mark on that chapter, a final confirmation that I'd chosen correctly when I walked away. I thought about karma, about how the universe has a way of balancing things. Michael had lost everything he valued, but not because I'd sought revenge or wished harm on him. He'd lost it all through the natural consequences of his own actions. Lies eventually come to light. Betrayal eventually catches up with you. The people you hurt eventually walk away. That's not karma in some mystical sense. That's just cause and effect. Meanwhile, I'd built something real and lasting. I had friends who knew the truth about me and loved me anyway. I had a home that was truly mine, bought with my own money, filled with my own choices. I had integrity, something no one could take from me because it came from within. And I had Emma, this beautiful child who had chosen to love me, who I'd chosen to love back, who reminded me every day that family is about choice and presence, not blood and obligation. My 80th birthday arrived on a crisp October morning. My friends threw me a party at the library, the community center being too formal for my tastes. There were maybe 30 people there. All people who mattered to me, all people I'd invited into my life because they added something genuine to it. Emma had made me a card, carefully decorated with drawings of books and flowers, and both of us holding hands. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me that love is patient and kind and true. You're the best grandma anyone could ask for." Helen made my favorite lemon cake. Ruth gave me a first edition of a mystery novel I'd been wanting. Grace, my widow friend, gave me a beautiful shawl she'd knitted. Emma's parents gave me a photo album filled with pictures of Emma and me over the years. Moments I'd forgotten were captured, memories preserved. Looking around that room at all these people who had become my chosen family, I felt overwhelmingly grateful. Not grateful for the pain I'd endured, but grateful for what I'd learned from it, for the strength it had forced me to develop, for the discernment it had taught me about who deserved space in my life. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was back in my cottage, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and that photo album. I looked at pictures of Emma and me planting flowers, reading books, making cookies, painting in my studio. I looked at pictures of me with my friends, laughing at some joke, deep in conversation, living a life I'd built from scratch. There was a knock at my door, and I opened it to find Emma standing there with her mother. "We forgot to give you one more thing," Emma said, bouncing with excitement. She handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small book with Grandma Sarah engraved on it. "I picked it out myself," Emma said proudly, "because you taught me to love reading, and I wanted you to have something that reminds you of us." I put it on immediately, and it caught the light, glinting on my wrist. "It's perfect," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." After they left, I sat on my porch one more time, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. I touched the bracelet on my wrist, thought about the day ahead, about all the days that had brought me here. I thought about Michael, somewhere in the world, carrying his regrets. I hoped he'd found some measure of peace. But his peace, or lack thereof, was no longer my concern. My peace was here, in this cottage, in this town, in this life I'd built. My peace was in knowing myself completely, in living honestly, in loving without fear because I'd learned that the right people won't betray that love. My peace was in the sound of the creek, the smell of roses, the memory of a child's laughter, the warmth of genuine friendship. I'd survived what felt unsurvivable. I'd rebuilt what felt irreparable. I'd found joy after devastation, peace after chaos, love after betrayal, not because I was special or particularly strong, but because I'd made a choice every single day to keep going, to keep building, to keep opening my heart to the possibility of good things. The night was beautiful, cool and clear, and I sat there for a long time, just being present in my own life. No regrets, no what-ifs, no anger at the past or fear of the future. Just this moment, this peace, this deep contentment that comes from knowing you've done the hard work of becoming who you were always meant to be. Somewhere, in the distance, I could hear the sound of the creek, constant and steady, flowing forward as it always had, as it always would, like time, like healing, like life itself, moving forward, carrying the past, but not held back by it, finding new paths around obstacles, wearing down the rough edges until everything is smooth. I thought about what I might say to that young woman I'd been, the one standing in that California suburb, heartbroken and lost, thinking her life was over. I'd tell her that it wasn't over, that it was just beginning. I'd tell her that the pain would fade, that she'd be stronger than she ever imagined, that she'd build a life so beautiful it would take her breath away. I'd tell her that someday she'd sit on a porch she owned, wearing a bracelet given to her by a child she didn't give birth to but loved as deeply as any biological mother, surrounded by friends she chose and who chose her back, content in a way she never was in that marriage she thought defined her. I'd tell her that leaving would be the hardest thing she'd ever do, and the best decision she'd ever make, that walking away from someone who doesn't value you isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself, that you can't love someone into being honest, can't sacrifice enough to make someone choose you, can't fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed. Most importantly, I'd tell her that she'd survive, more than survive, she'd thrive. The woman she'd become would be wiser, kinder, stronger, more herself than the woman she was in that marriage. And that woman would look back and realize that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is really the universe pushing you toward something better. As I finally stood to go inside, I paused at my door and looked back at my little piece of paradise, my cottage, my garden, my peaceful existence. I thought about karma one more time, about how it had found Michael, how it had found me too, but in a different way. He destroyed our home, our marriage, my trust, my dreams, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently given me the greatest gift, freedom. Freedom to discover who I was without him, to build a life based on truth rather than lies, to choose my own path. He'd lost what money can't buy, the genuine love and respect of everyone around him, the peace that comes from living with integrity, and I'd gained what money can't buy, true friendship, uncomplicated love, and the kind of peace that settles deep in your bones and stays. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so full and meaningful that the person who hurt you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. I went inside, locked my door, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, Emma and I were going to start a new painting project. Helen wanted help organizing a book drive for the school. Ruth had invited me to lunch to discuss forming a book club. My life, my beautiful, simple, honest life, would continue. And I would continue in it, grateful for every lesson, even the painful ones, that had brought me here. As I settled into bed that night, my last thought before sleep was this: I thought the man I married was my forever, until the day I found out he'd already promised forever to someone else. But the truth is, he was never my forever. I am my own forever, and that's exactly how it should be.